Nothing human is foreign to us. The key missing, we think, in our society is a healthy sense and a solid sense of equality. The anti-communist Cold War era convinced many of us Americans that equality equals conformity, homogeneity, and tyranny. The truth is that equality is what is needed to have diversity and freedom for everyone, rather than a select few.
I think that's actually quite correct, but I would also add that one of the things that has also been set up as a dichotomy, as an opposing set of values, is freedom and equality. And I think you see this now. And if you look at some of the things that comes out of certain people's mouths at this point in time, you'll agree with this, but that equality and freedom are now at odds with each other. So I would add
Right.
that as well.
Yeah, I think the most damaging thing about this takeover by this radical right-wing ideology is in the end going to be the abandonment of responsibility and accountability in the name of freedom. That's just not how any society of any size in any time in history has ever functioned successfully anyhow. There's no exception to that, as far as I know.
No, and it's not the Enlightenment ideal, and no one in the Enlightenment advocated for that. As a matter of fact, freedom has always been tempered by responsibility to others, and it was always bounded by responsibility to make sure that your freedom didn't clash with other people's freedom. And when it did, it was actually not referred to as freedom, it was referred to as license. I'm sure that you've heard the term licentious behavior before.
That's right.
That's where
Yeah.
that comes from. Yeah, it's never been looked upon as a positive thing.
These ultra libertarians or whatever you want to call them, these Ayn Rand lovers, to them, people should be allowed to act freely, irrespectively of consequences, is what they're really saying. But what people? Them, not others that disagree with them. And also, let's not forget that in this country, corporations are people. The ability of corporations to be uninhibited in how they conduct themselves. So there's two things really. Freedom only applies to them. Everyone else must conform or be forced to conform, which is the opposite of freedom, if you ask me. This licentiousness, as you say, without any consequence, it's just going to create a sea of scams. And this impoverishes everyone else, destroys the lives of countless people. This is going to tear our society in pieces.
Well, I think there's a case to be made that at some level, at the lowest level, it already has. I mean, we have 60% of our population at this point is concerned with paycheck to paycheck living that couldn't withstand a small tragedy, an
Good.
unexpected expense that is starting to become food insecure as food prices continue to rise, as rents continue to rise. They become shelter insecure, and
That's
I
right.
think that there is no light at the end of the tunnel right now. And I don't know how that's going to change, because no one is talking about changing that except for maybe Bernie Sanders. They're talking about other things that have no material benefit to the 60-70% of our population. So I would say that that's already starting to tear us under. Now, that doesn't take into account any of the recent destructive behavior, like the mass layoffs of the federal government or destruction of Medicaid. Not only is that going to have just catastrophic material consequences for people's health, but you also have to remember that $800 billion, it will not be spent, which means what? That healthcare workers and the healthcare industry is also going to suffer, and that there'll be more layoffs, more people without jobs, and there'll be more insecurity.
There'll be a multiplier effect with a lot of people. Far more than government workers are going to lose their jobs, and whole industries are under threat, including healthcare. The other thing to never forget is that we have a worker participation rate in this country of about 62%, which means only about 62% of the workforce is working. There's a huge number of people that are dependent on government aid and assistance in this country. And that's exactly what they're targeting. The bill that passed in the House was $2.3 trillion worth of cuts.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they really thought this through and what it's going to do to their own constituency.
See, from my perspective, I don't know that the Republican representatives have thought it through, but I think that people like Thiel and Musk, I think they thought it through. They have been thinking it through for quite some time now. One of the people that works for Musk, one of the older people, not one of the younger people, actually has a PhD from the George Mason School. And as we know, that's one of the strains of neoliberal libertarian economic thought. This is part and parcel of what they have been arguing really since the end of World War II.
That's a
And
great point. Yes. And let's do that some other day because we have so much to talk about. Well, we will
yeah,
go back to that past and examine where this all comes from. It's really kind of startling. These intellectual and theoretical threads that have woven themselves into this movement.
so we do need to go back and we do need to kind of break that down for people. This has been planned for a while, but one of the other things to understand is all of these jobs that are being dismantled. These are what we would call good jobs. In other words, they have a living wage, they have a career path, and they have benefits.
Yes.
That's really important to understand. These jobs are going away en masse over the last, 4 to 6 weeks.
Here, let's return to our idea of equality because it's very much related to all this. Equality being the principle that all individuals should have the same rights, opportunities, and treatment regardless of their background, identity, or circumstances. Now, it can be understood in different ways. It can begin with equal rights to participate in governance, like voting, representation, holding office. It could mean equal treatment under the law, ensuring no one is above or below legal protections and enforcement. One has equal standing and respect within a community in a democratic civil society, regardless of class or race or gender or any other characteristic. Equal access to resources is another form in terms of economic justice, that wealth and opportunities are there for everyone to prevent extreme disparities and terrible living conditions for anyone.
I would also add dignity. I think that's really where equality comes in. Each person should have dignity and should be seen as worthy of dignity.
Well, I think that's underlies in all of this, really. If you don't believe that there's an inherent dignity to being a person, in fact, I would say there's an inherent dignity to all of life, that we are just have abandoned that notion of being stewards for life on this planet.
Well, I think that's one of the problems that we are going to face. We've started to see the effects of through climate changes, through extreme weather. It's started to take its toll already.
Yeah. It's really important to understand that what we see in history and in culture is that more equal societies make better use of human capital. They create more shared wealth. Inequality instead often breeds unrest, crime, and in some cases even revolution. Right? Countries of greater equality have lower rates of crime. They have more economic social stability. They have less need to fiercely compete for scarce resources because they are shared. When people from different backgrounds can contribute to ideas freely, societies become more dynamic and more adaptable. Governance becomes more representative and more accountable. Societies where all citizens have a voice just simply have stronger democratic institutions and certainly less corruption.
Well, I think it can be compared to a concept of biodiversity, social diversity. I mean, in engineering, we call it robustness, right?
Right.
The system can withstand more because it has more opportunities to recover. It has more opportunities for resources. It has more opportunities to have input from different sectors. It has more opportunities to grow in different directions if one direction is cut off from it. It's just simply more robust, and it's very similar to biodiversity. And I think that there's not necessarily an accident that we don't value biodiversity any more than we value social diversity.
Certainly so. What equality engenders is more health, more happiness, higher life expectancy, lower infant mortality, a richness of cultures and society. It just makes everything better. Honestly, it does. The question that we're going to ask in this show, and this is the crux of it here, why are we having so much trouble creating a more equal society in America? Why is progress towards equality constantly under assault?
Yeah, I think that's the main question. And I don't think that that's something that's new. The concept of equality has first been posited in the Enlightenment itself.
That's right. Let's just take a close look at where we're going with this sense of equality in this country. We have already extremes of inequality that are at on par, if not exceed, the robber baron age in the late 19th century. The actions of Doge and the government right now are seeking to take away what's left of the benefits that our society has decided to share to try to make things a little bit more equal, take those all away and directly funnel them back to the highest tier of wealth in our society. They're going to be cutting trillions of dollars from benefits and services to people, everyday people, to be able to pass a tax cut that's going to go directly to people who are already obscenely rich. During the pandemic, the top wealthy class gained trillions of dollars of wealth. Now, how does that happen? And this has just been a pattern that we have been seeing since the dawn of the neoliberal age. So, Ed, could you just simply describe what neoliberal really means? What are we talking about here? How is neoliberalism really challenging our notion of creating a more just and more equal society?
I will try to be brief, summarize it in a way that's easy to understand. It's a term that's debated, for one thing. It's a term that not everyone agrees on. It's a term that's very old. It's almost 100 years old. When our society during the Great Depression decided that we needed to take a different path and to prepare safety nets for people, understanding that we had the boom and bust cycle and that we could, under the rules of Keynesianism, John Maynard Keynes, prepare for that and understand how to soften the blows of, we set up a system of safety nets like unemployment insurance, like welfare, like social security system, eventually Medicare, although that was done under Johnson about 30 years later. But that was a way that we decided that it would be much more stable for our society. Also, at the time, and I would assert that it is actually still true to this day, but at the time it was seen as a way to avoid fascism. People who were wanting were seen as a threat to democracy. In other words, the inequality itself, and especially economic inequality, was thought to leave people vulnerable to fascist ideology. So the solution for that was to build the New Deal with all these safety nets in it. And there was a consensus, even among the wealthy, even among the capitalists, that to avoid either a socialist revolution or fascism, which neither of which was desirable, especially as we fought and won World War II, that we would continue on with this safety net and maybe even expand it. After World War II and after we came out of World War II not only victorious, but relatively unscathed and as a single power across the world, not only militarily, but economically, as Europe and the Soviet Union laid in ruins, literally, from the bombardment and the war itself, something changed and we'll go into that in more detail in other episodes, but something changed, or a strain of our political system decided that we no longer wanted to adhere to that, and we wanted to go back to day of more pure capitalism and hark back to the classical era of capitalism, but we were going to call it neoclassical at this point in time. And the classical period was led by the original liberals, not the new liberals of FDR, but the original liberals. So they termed it as neoliberalism. And what it really means is a capitalism without regulations, a capitalism without barriers, a capitalism without concern to general stakeholders in the society, but with most of the concern focused on the actual shareholders who own shares in the company. And as this has developed over the last, let's say, 50, 60 years, it's turned out to be a very extreme focus on companies and corporations focusing 100% on, does this add value? Does this not only just add value, but then it turned into maximizing. Does this maximize the value to our shareholders? And that's been the main decision-making model. If it does, then that's what we're going to do. If it doesn't, we're not going to do that. And then it turned into an ethos for all of society that all of society should be based on this model of all of us should be entrepreneurs. And you see that, in the culture. All of us should be focused on shareholder value. All of us should be identify with corporations. Corporations should identify with society. We should be taking care of ourselves, that extreme individualism and extreme individual responsibility should be the social ethic, not working together, nothing collective. As we move forward, things like unions, things like civic clubs, they fell out of favor. Even bowling leagues fell out of favor for the actual individualism. Things like moving to the suburbs after the war, effect of that, and it helped to individualize us. It helped to isolate us. And as we went through the 80s, 90s, to the early 2000s, it just became the entire ethic for our society that we were here to take care of ourselves, that government really shouldn't be here for anything other than settling property disputes, business disputes, taking care of our security and our military safety. The safety net that was put together during the New Deal and under Johnson and the Great Society needed to go away because it wasn't adding value mostly to the shareholders. And this idea that, taxes is kind of theft, that people should not pay taxes and should not be taking care of each other. They should just be taking care of themselves. And I think the ultimate expression of that was said by Margaret Thatcher when she had said at one point in time in the early 80s that there is no society, there are only individuals and families.
Right. And then Ronald Reagan added to that by saying government is the problem.
Right.
Not government needs to get out of the way, needs to get smaller, needs to be very limited. That's created the philosophical landscape that we see around us. So we have this American liberalism that's about taking capitalism and making it softer by giving people some benefits. And then you have this conservative / libertarian ideology about free markets and capitalism being unfettered. And the latter basically has come to win most of the the argument at this point. Unfortunately, since we've gone to a neoliberal model and our policies and our structures of our society and government have changed, it's created much, much more hardship. And this hardship has continued to grow until it finally led to populist movements in America that hadn't seen since before World War II. Some of it was on the left, like Occupy Wall Street and eventually Bernie Sanders. Some of it was on the right, ultimately led to the Tea Party and then the Trump movement. The institutions, the political institutions in our electoral process, the Democratic and Republican Party had to make choices. What were they going to do? How were they going to handle with this new rising populism? In the side of the Republicans, Donald Trump became a very charismatic and dominating figure and began to capture the imagination, almost in a mythical way, of the Republican right, ultimately leading to the whole party becoming nothing more than MAGA. On the left, it was a bit more of a contest. Bernie Sanders and a lot of the left progressives were eventually institutionally pushed out of the Democratic Party center. The populist movement there wasn't embraced just like it was on the right wing side. It was more like managed, not necessarily squashed per se, but managed so that it didn't really undermine the institutional centrist structure of the Democratic Party. Well, it turns out we were in a moment of populism because of the turmoil caused by neoliberalism. Really angered a lot of people. It created a lot of destitution. It created a lot of uncertainty, a lot of distrust. And a lot Americans were looking for answers. Populism, I think, won out. But because I think that the Democratic Party wasn't really willing to fully embrace going to the left, it did to some extent, but not nearly enough. Whereas the Republican side went with it all the way. And here we are today. And those two sides represent that model between equality on the left being primary or being most important, and then freedom on the right being primary and most important. Sadly, all the fears that you mentioned, Ed, about having a society that's just not well taken care of, that's destitute, leading to fascism, have turned out to be correct.
Well, if you listen to FDR's last State of the Union address, where he actually outlines his proposal for the second Bill of Rights, he introduces it as a warning as much as a proposal, where he says we understand what the ramifications are of having necessitous men. And what he means by that is people who are experiencing economic inequality and wants and needs that aren't being fulfilled. And he really viewed the need to move to even greater social safety nets as the formula for blocking fascism.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass, and his vice president was forced off the ticket in 1944, and we took a different path through history. But that being said, I think that it's worth mentioning too, from my tradition, my intellectual tradition, I would also add to the analysis of the last election that although the Democrats were working towards equality, it was an equality based on idealistic equality. And when I say that, I don't mean idealism as in utopian or anything. I mean they were working through intellectual and social equality, and they totally ignored the material conditions of the mass majority of the population.
Well, when the right portions of the corporate class in particular decided to take us into a neoliberal directions, the Democrats had to make a choice. Were they going to fight against it and resist that? Or were they going to try to go with it and temper it and make it more gentle for the American people? They chose the latter. They tried to go with it, and they became collaborators in a sense. What happened is, as the neoliberal model began to really take hold and really start to change our society, damage the middle class, cause a lot of suspicion and despair, that changed the very fundamental structure of our landscape culturally. It just wasn't working. It was working for some people, but it wasn't working for a lot of people. Listen, regulated capitalist liberal model has a lot of benefits. It does a lot of good, but we went into a different place where it wasn't sustainable anymore, as opposed to maybe some places in Europe where it was. In this country, because of the decline in the middle class and the anger that caused, it wasn't sustainable just to go along to get along and keep that model. Because slowly every year, more and more benefits were mediated away, and ultimately on the right, their vision was to eradicate liberal democracy altogether and create a different model. And so they didn't go along with it. They continued to strive to create the conditions where they could transcend it into their vision of society that we're seeing play out right now in government. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think because the Democrats decided to go to that third way, as Clinton put it, I think that it resulted in what some people have called the ratcheting effect, where they viewed their job as to basically continue to try to pull the Republicans back to the center. But what ended up happening is they themselves were pulled back to the center as the Republicans kept lurching to the right, lurching to the right, lurching to the right. Turns out it did not offer a significant amount of resistance, enough at least to prevent what we see happening right now. So we really need to rethink what's actually needed for the future. We need to rethink what the strategy is.
That's right. This is what we're all about here. I do want to add one other thing, though. There were certainly some successes in church work progress, social justice, rights for people. There's a lot of progress that was made, even though eventually this progress was challenged and largely now is under great assault and being destroyed. But that social progress, like gay rights, like civil rights, like women's rights, environmental rights, was all good stuff. However, in the end, it wasn't sustainable, because underneath it all, what was not touched, what was not really challenged, was economic justice. And without economic justice, with neoliberalism continuing to change the economic model, less regulations, far more benefits to the wealthy, ultimately the power dynamics continue to shift more and more and more to the right, where all of a sudden, even the gains on the social justice level were no longer sustainable. The right had achieved so much power, they could now progress to Project 25, which includes both the economic and social and cultural transformations, not just economic dominance.
Well, yeah, and I think we can explore that more, but that's one of the things that we need to understand is that there are limits to social democracy. There are limits to the liberal welfare state. And the main limit is, as you said, it doesn't challenge the economic justice aspect of it. And as much as people don't want to hear this, the answer is this is about a power dynamic. And as long as we don't have economic equality, it's very difficult to complete the puzzle of true equality in our society, because we still leave the main lever that moves our society, the material lever, in the hands of people who, as we see, are not really all that morally trustworthy.
Well, to put it simply, money equals power. Money equals power. And the more wealth is generated and goes to the top, the more power goes to the top. And eventually, the highest tier of society gain so much power, they're able to challenge and they're able to reshape the society however they want. And that's literally what's happening right now.
Literally. And that, that's the thing. We had the New Deal, we had the Great Society until we didn't. We had an agreement with the capitalist class until we didn't. The bottom line to remember is we had what we had, but only at their discretion. And once they decided that they no longer wanted that safety net in place, they put provisions in place, they put plans in place that resulted in what we see right now, that culminated in this Project 2025, and that culminated in neoliberalism and the rolling out of neoliberalism. In future episodes, we're going to actually deconstruct all this for everyone so they can understand that this started a long time ago. It didn't come out of the blue. It didn't just happen with Trump. It didn't just happen even with the Bushes. It happened a long time ago, and it was in the works for a while. But the bottom line is, as long as we don't have economic equality, as long as we don't have economic justice, the power will always lay with them, and whatever concessions that we are able to gain will only be at their discretion. And when they decide that that's over, then it's over.
And this is important to know to move forward. How do we then challenge and resist this neoliberal wave that's led to very strong fascist tendencies? We should do a show as well on distinguishing what fascism is and how it is different from other forms of social control.
And also how it can dovetail with neoliberalism, and how ironically this concept of individual liberty can lead to social control, even though intuitively it doesn't sound like they actually mesh with each other, but in fact they do.
Paradox that we really need to address. In any case, thank you for listening, and we'll get back to you. Okay?
Yeah, okay.